You've been farming a points program for 10 weeks. The dashboard shows a number you like. You've been tracking it every few days, and it's been climbing the way you expected. Then one day a blog post goes up, or a tweet thread starts circulating. Or worse, someone quietly edits a docs page and nobody says a word about it. And suddenly the multiplier you were counting on is gone, or the eligibility window moved, or a whole category of wallets just got zeroed out overnight. I run proxy infrastructure and cloud phone farms for a living. Real hardware and real IP diversity across hundreds of devices. And I approach airdrop farming the same way, as an operations problem, not a lottery ticket. I've watched enough seasons run their course to say this plainly. Rule changes mid-seasons are not rare. They are close to the default outcome. And if you're running more than a handful of wallets, you need to plan for one the same way you plan for gas spikes or an RPC node going down. This isn't a video about which program is trustworthy or what your points will eventually be worth. And I'm not going to tell you what any of this converts to or predict where a token lands, because nobody honestly knows that, and I'm not in the business of guessing for you. What this is about is the mechanics, why these changes happen partway through a season, what they tend to look like when they land, and how to structure wallets and habits so one policy update doesn't erase months of legitimate work. Start with why the rules move at all. Most points programs get built before the team has any real usage data to work from. They set multipliers, referral bonuses, and category weights of projections and best guesses. Then they watch what actually happens once real capital and real bots start touching the system, and reality almost never matches the spreadsheet they built in week 1. The first pressure is behavior nobody modeled for. Say a program rewards total value locked with a flat multiplier, and someone works out a loop that recycles the same capital through 5 different contracts to multiply their apparent exposure 5 times over. The team is now looking at a drain on their token allocation that their model never accounted for, and they either eat that cost or they patch it, and the patch almost always comes after the fact, because the loop wasn't obvious to anyone until someone actually ran it at scale. The second pressure is funding, plain and simple. A lot of these programs are a placeholder for a token that hasn't launched yet, and if the team does the math partway through and realizes the point supply implies handing out a bigger token allocation than they can or want to give away, they adjust the conversion rate, they add a haircut, or they introduce a new tier system out of nowhere. It gets dressed up as a rules update, but underneath it, it's a budget problem. The third pressure is detection catching up to activity that already happened. CBO monitoring on most programs gets built and switched on after launch, not before, which means the early weeks of a season are often the least scrutinized stretch of the whole thing, and the later weeks bring retroactive sweeps once the team finally has enough on-chain history to build clustering models against. When that catches up, they rarely announce it as, "We are now enforcing CBO rules." They call it an update to eligibility criteria, and the enforcement quietly reaches backward. A mid-season change rarely shows up as one dramatic announcement with a bang. It's almost always incremental, and it's built to be missed by anyone who isn't actively tracking their own numbers day to day. One common shape is a multiplier that started the season at 2 times and quietly drops to 1.2 times with no changelog entry anywhere, and the only way you'd catch it is if you were already tracking your own accrual rate closely enough to notice the math had shifted under you. Another shape is a snapshot date that gets moved earlier than what was originally implied, which cuts off activity you did in good faith based on the timeline the team communicated at the start, and there's no real recourse once that date has already passed. Another shape is new wording that gets quietly added to a terms page, something like language about artificial or automated interaction that simply wasn't there when the season opened. And its whole purpose is to give the team broad discretion to zero out addresses later, without having to define exactly what counts. And another shape is the points to token conversion ratio, which often only gets revealed at the very end of a season, and turns out to be far less generous than the community had assumed based on the early messaging, with nothing dishonest necessarily said, just nothing pinned down either. And the last common shape is a retroactive CBO pass, where wallets get flagged based on clustering signals the operator never had visibility into in the first place, because the actual criteria the team used were never published anywhere for anyone to check their own activity against. The thread running through all 5 of these is asymmetry. The team can change the rules whenever they decide to, because they control the ledger and they control the smart contract deploys. And you find out after it's already happened, usually from a Discord announcement or from someone else spotting a diff on a docs page and posting a screenshot of it. It's worth actually understanding how a team or a chain analysis vendor decides that a cluster of wallets belongs to one operator, because that's what explains why some mid-season sweeps feel completely arbitrary and others clearly don't. Clustering works by looking for signals shared across addresses, rather than judging any single wallet on its own. The common ones are funding that traces back to the same source wallet, or the same small handful of source wallets, transaction timing that lines up almost exactly across addresses, like bots firing in the same block or within the same few seconds of each other, Caliday patterns that are identical or nearly identical, addresses that only ever touch the same contracts in the same order every single time, and withdrawal paths that all funnel back into one common wallet or one common exchange deposit address. None of those signals is conclusive by itself. Together, they build a confidence score, and each team sets its own threshold for what counts as Sybil enough to actually exclude, which is exactly why enforcement looks inconsistent from the outside, even when the underlying signals are pretty similar case to case. This is why funding hygiene matters more than almost anything else in this hobby. A set of wallets that all trace back to one exchange withdrawal, moved in the same pattern, and hit contracts in lockstep with each other is trivial to flag even with fairly basic tooling. A set of wallets with staggered funding, varied timing, and genuinely different interaction patterns is much harder to tie together with any confidence. And a team enforcing Sybil rules after the fact has to weigh the risk of false positives against how much value they're actually clawing back. Which is exactly why some operators get caught in a sweep while others walk away clean, despite doing things that look similar on paper. Picture two versions of the same 20 wallet operation to make this concrete. Version 1 buys $30 of gas token from one exchange account, splits it out to 20 wallets within the same hour, and every one of those wallets then goes and interacts with the exact same 3 contracts, in the exact same order within a few minutes of each other. Version 2 spreads that same funding across several different exchange accounts and several different days, and the 20 wallets interact with contracts at different times in different orders with different amounts. Version 1 is the kind of pattern that shows up as one bright cluster on a graph the moment anyone looks. Version 2 still might get scrutinized. On-chain activity is never fully invisible, but it doesn't hand a detection model an easy answer. So if clustering and mid-season rule changes are just the reality of this space, the response isn't to chase one program's exact stated requirements as if they're locked in stone. It's to build habits that hold up no matter what a team decides to change 3 months from now. That starts with separating funding sources instead of funneling everything from one hub, since a single deposit wallet that seeds 20 addresses within a tight window is a pattern that gets picked up by clustering tools whether or not the program has even published a Sybil policy yet. It also means keeping your own records, screenshot dashboards on a regular schedule, note snapshot dates and multipliers as they get published, and save copies of terms pages before anyone has a chance to edit them quietly. Because if a program changes eligibility retroactively, a timestamped record of what the rules actually said when you acted on them is the only real leverage you have in a dispute or an appeal. It also means not treating one program's stated terms as if they're a binding contract. Points aren't a token yet in most cases, and whoever's issuing them usually reserves the right to change the conversion later. So treat a season's rules as a working draft rather than a promise, and size the time and infrastructure you put into it accordingly, instead of assuming a specific multiplier is going to hold all the way to the end. It also means spreading activity across multiple programs instead of concentrating everything in one. When a single season gets rewritten out from under you, the cost is a lot smaller when it's one line item among several rather than the entire farm. And it means varying timing and interaction patterns across wallets doing similar tasks. Not because you're trying to break anyone's terms, but because genuinely distinct usage, different times of day, different order of operations, different amounts, is both more representative of how independent real users actually behave and less prone to the exact lockstep pattern that clustering tools are built specifically to catch. To be clear, none of this is about hiding activity that actually breaks a platform's rules. It's about not building an operation that looks identical to a script running on a timer, because that exact pattern reads the same way to a detection system, whether the intent behind it was adversarial or not. When an announcement actually lands, the instinct is to go react in the Discord thread immediately. A more useful first move is to check 3 things: whether the change applies retroactively or only going forward, whether it even touches a category you're actually in, and whether the team has published concrete criteria or just gestured vaguely at unusual activity. Programs that publish real criteria, funding patterns, contract interaction thresholds, timing windows, are giving you something you can actually audit your own wallets against. Programs that don't are telling you enforcement is discretionary, and no amount of careful reading is going to fully protect you from a judgment call made after the fact. Mid-season rule changes are a structural feature of how points programs get built, not some rare exception to watch out for. Planning around that, instead of assuming the first version of the rules is the final one, is what separates an operation that survives a rewrite from one that has to start completely over from scratch. I found these the boring, methodical way, and write up what actually qualifies. The full guides and the tools I trust are at airdropfarming.org. Full written guides and tested tool picks are waiting for you at airdropfarming.org, so go take a look. And if this was useful to you, hit subscribe for the next breakdown.